Are you willing to change your mind on a controversial topic? Welcome, my Mere Mortalites, to another round of the Mere Mortals book reviews. My name is Kyron, host of the Mere Mortals podcast, but also this one where I dive deeper into the books that I'm reading to give you the juicy information, a little review of what I think of the book, some topics that we can take out for it, and maybe we can even change our minds, which is indeed what we have today. It is the book How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan with the subtitle The New Science of Psychedelics. So this book was published in 2018 and it's 400 to 450 pages in length, depending on if you count glossaries and bibliographies and all those sorts of things in your reading. So it took me about 7 hours to really get through in total. It's a dive into the North American history of psychedelics and I suppose the upcoming science also in North America of what is being studied with psychedelics and how they're being treated. So it focuses primarily on 3 different types, and these are LSD, so lysergic acid diethylamide, which was the famously created by Albert Hofmann. And then we have psilocybin, so this is the one you'll typically find in magic mushrooms. And finally, DMT, also known as dimethyltryptamine, which you can find in ones such as ayahuasca and in the toad, which is kind of like a toad which produces it, and it's like its kind of poison thing on its back. Now, this book in total, I wouldn't say is overly scientific, but it does contain many anecdotes of studies and things like that. And there's a fair bit of kind of subjective ponderings and trip reports and ideas about what psychedelics do and theories and whatnot. So it kind of mixes, I guess, the science as well as the more subjective part. So there are 6 chapters. There's a prologue and epilogue, and as I mentioned, there was that etc. part, which has all of the things like the glossary, acknowledgements, notes, bibliography, index. I'll quickly run through these so you have an idea of what is here. So we have Chapter 1, A Renaissance. Chapter 2, Natural History, Beshroomed and Dakota. Chapter 3, History, The First Wave. Part 1, The Promise. Part 2, The Crack Up and the Coda. Chapter 4, Travelogue, Journeying Underground. Trip 1, LSD. Trip 2, Psilocybin. Trip 3, 5-MeO DMT or the Toad. Chapter 5, The Neuroscience, Your Brain on Psychedelics. Chapter 6, The Trip Treatment, Psychedelics and Psychotherapy. 1, Dying. 2, Addiction. 3, Depression. And then we have the Coda. So a fair bit of stuff going on there. And in terms of the author himself, Michael Pollan, he is a journalist, author, and I believe you can even find a series on Netflix based on this book itself if you are more of a watcher or a videoer than an actual reader. He's more notable for his food books. So these are things diving into kind of the science of food, subjective experiences with that and whatnot. And his style of writing is very similar to Malcolm Gladwell. So if you've checked out my review of David and Goliath on this channel, you get a feeling of how he writes. And there's many an overlap in kind of styles on the way they structure their books. So let's get on to the first theme, and for this I have written down the science. What can we say for certain? So the problem with psychedelics is that they really hover between these 2 worlds of the subjective and then also the kind of objective. We'll start with the history, and there's a troubled history for sure, and especially if you're looking from a North American perspective and especially US perspective on this. And it's hard to go past someone like Timothy Leary. So he was a professor at Harvard in, I'm going to say, the 1960s. So this was right around the age when kind of LSD was gaining popularity. People really starting to know about it. And it was diffusing into the culture more. And so this is where it was kind of got mixed up with the hippie culture. Timothy Leary himself was labeled as the most dangerous man in America by the then president, Richard Nixon. And his scientific studies of LSD and of psychedelics were questionable, to say the least. They weren't super rock solid. And so he ended up getting kicked out of Harvard. And basically, I say you could categorize this period of there was this new substance, new drug, and it was adopted by a lot of exuberant researchers. So this is people who would likely take it themselves whilst also studying the effects of it on other people, which led to poorly designed, controlled, and reported studies. And this is when it started to get political, and basically, in the end, the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration, cracked down and made it a banned controlled substance. So this put it on the same kind of, well, I don't want to speak exactly because I don't know exactly where on the level it was, but it was certainly not, it was harder to be studied, and it was not something you could buy legally, for sure. And so it went underground, and basically all research on it stopped for many a decade until relatively recently. So I think the year 2006 popped up a fair few times in this book as when, okay, we're starting to get more licenses or the ability to actually study these. We can actually do more studies on not just LSD, but on also these other substances, particularly psilocybin, so the magic mushrooms. Now, what does it help? What's the actual purpose of these? Like, if you're taking a drug, there's usually a scientific reason for it, where you want an objective reason for taking something, and recreational use is certainly has a value in itself, but in the main portion, they're suggesting that this can be very helpful with depression, with addiction, and then also with existential angst. So this is kind of those people who are dying on their deathbeds and are having, this, I guess, worry is what you might call it, anxiety, something like that. So how this actually works is that there is a place called the default mode network. So I'm going to jump here to page 303 and 304, and I can read this out. So the default mode network appears to play a role in the creation of mental constructs or projections, the most important of which is the construct we call the self or ego. This is why some neuroscientists call it the me network. If a researcher gives you a list of adjectives and asks you to consider how they apply to you, it is your default mode network that leaps into that action and lights up. And basically, it's that kind of when you're just daydreaming, thinking. That's typically when you'll see this portion of your brain light up. And basically, what these substances do, the psychedelics, is they deactivate it. So it gives more kind of free range to kind of creativity in a way, and opening up pathways and networks in your brain that perhaps are either underused or have not been used at all. And so there was a very good analogy in the book of how you could have skiers going down a ski slope, and as more and more people go, they'll tend to create more and more tracks in a certain line, and so then the people who are coming further behind, they're likely to fall into these same tracks and follow these same paths. Whereas something like DMT, for example, will kind of deactivate it. So imagine a bunch of fresh snow being put all over these, a temporary experience of fresh snow being put over all of these tracks, and so then the people coming down the ski slope now have the ability to explore elsewhere on the ski slope, that sort of thing. So there definitely does seem to be a reason for this, and there's many pros and some cons as to what psychedelics do and what they are useful for. So some of the pros, I should say, are they're usually single dose. You don't need a continual supply of it. They usually have pretty long-lasting effects, and they don't seem to be addictive. So they're non-addictive. So there is no kind of physiological activations that occur, which is like, I need to now have more LSD or magic mushrooms or whatnot. There doesn't seem to be any of that going on in comparison to things like caffeine or alcohol. Now, this is a problem, especially for the kind of pharmacological industry as it stands at the moment, who actually want all of these other things. They don't want a long-lasting drug. They want one that can be sold repeatedly, so a multi-dose type of thing. And they do want an addictive one because people will keep coming back to it. And so this is why you see things like SSRIs and the opiate crisis happening in America, where people are getting hooked on fentanyl and some very, very nasty stuff. Now, what are some of the cons? Well, you can see that you can imagine it'll be very destabilizing. So if you are having visual hallucinations, if your normal everyday experience is being you're transported, your ego is dissolving. You can imagine this is a very destabilizing experience, and I can see how this would not work for a whole lot of people, especially ones who maybe have already pre-existing mental issues and things like that. It's very labor intensive. Typically, if you're a scientist studying this, you need to have multiple people in the room to combat the experience, or at least help out with the experience of a bad trip. There's a lot of political baggage. That's not a particularly scientific thing, but it exists nevertheless, and it can cause radical changes. And so we do have a fair few stories in the book of volunteers going into some of these studies, and then they have an experience on LSD or psilocybin or something like that. And one lady in particular is getting picked up by her husband. Her husband came late, and on the car ride back, she announced her intention to divorce him, which was something she realized from this trip. Now, does this mean if you take psilocybin, you're going to make radical changes and divorce your husband? Probably not. That was probably a long brewing sort of issue that was highlighted, and I'll talk more about that in the subjective part coming up in the next theme. So I suppose the main actual scientific thing to do with all of this is it's very difficult to study, very, very difficult. So if I jump to page 333 here, there's a pretty good section here where it explains why. So yet even as psychedelic therapies are being tested by modern science, the very strangeness of these molecules and their actions upon the mind is at the same time testing whether Western medicine can deal with the implicit changes they pose. To cite one obvious example, conventional drug trials of psychedelics are difficult, if not impossible, to blind. So this is to make sure that, I'll keep reading. Most participants can tell whether they've received psilocybin or a placebo, and so can their guides. So you can't have double-blind studies, which is the kind of peak best way of doing the scientific method, where neither the experimenter nor the volunteer knows what they've got, and so this can rule out many biases introduced by expectations and placebo effects and things like this. Also, in testing these drugs, how can researchers hope to tease out the chemicals' effect from the critical influence of set and setting? So the set and setting is an idea that's been in the kind of psychedelic community for a long time, which is if you're taking one of these drugs, you want to have your setting, your actual environment, reflective of something that'll be conducive to either an experience that you kind of want. So you probably don't want to be in, a prison cell being tortured whilst taking a psychedelic. That's probably not the greatest setting. Maybe somewhere more outdoorsy and a bit more natural is maybe a better environment for you to be in. You don't want to be perhaps taking these when you're next to some neighbors who are having a violent argument, or in a really loud place and you hate loud noises. You get the idea. And then your set is your mindset coming into it. What do I want to gain from this experience? Is it, am I trying to solve a problem? Am I taking this for some fun? Am I, trying to figure out some problems that are deep within me and resolve them? Will I run away from these problems? All of these sorts of things play an important part into the experience that comes from taking a psychedelic. Continuing on. Western science and modern drug testing depend on the ability to isolate a single variable, but it isn't clear that the effects of a psychedelic drug can ever be isolated, whether from the context in which it is administered, the presence of the therapists involved, or the volunteer's expectations. Any of these factors can muddy the waters of causality. And how is Western medicine to evaluate a psychiatric drug that appears to work not by means of any strictly pharmacological effect, but by administering a certain kind of experience in the minds of people who take it? So yeah, there's quite a few things that are going on here. I've written some extra notes of other problems that were being talked about of why it's hard to study. They have to use ECGs, which is a method of determining kind of blood flow in the brain, and therefore a way of determining how much activity is going on in certain sections of the brain whilst something is happening. In this case, if someone's on a psychedelic. And that is generally not the best method to use it. You'd actually want kind of what are those called? Implants of nodes put into the actual, directly linking to the brain itself and getting electrical signals like they do for rats and mice and other animals that they test upon. But obviously for humans that is a little bit more difficult. There's also a lot of room for things being influencing the outcome. So this is, if you're trying to measure someone using an ECG scan, they need to be, sitting still in a very enclosed environment with machines whirring around their head to study this. That's going to influence it. The lab room itself, that's going to influence it. The kind of artifacts and things in the room. So people bring in, little religious symbols and symbolism, and there's birth stories and everything that you have heard about what a psychedelic is pre-hand, coming in and trying it out for the first time as a volunteer, that's going to influence it. So it's very hard to take the human out of any of these things, whether it be on the volunteer side or the observer, practicus, the scientist side as well. Very, very difficult to reproduce any of these things, which is the core of the scientific method. I create a study, I say this is how you do it, you follow these exact steps, and then someone in India can do it, someone in Pakistan can do it, someone in the bottom of the ocean can bloody do it. Like, it doesn't matter. That's the point of the scientific method. And yet these are relying on consciousness. Kind of, that's where it's all coming down to, the boiling point. This is all about consciousness and subjectivity. So very, very hard thing to study. It can be done, and there are efforts to it, but it's difficult, which gets us bang onto our next section, which is the subjective. What can we say? So the last part was what can we say for certain? What can we say now? Well, the first thing is it tends to draw in unique, enigmatic individuals. I've already slightly mentioned Timothy Leary, and if his Wikipedia page or his bio is worth diving into, and I know he has many biographies and things like that. A very enigmatic individual there. And it's the question, I guess, is also, does it draw in out of the box people already, or does it kind of create them? So is someone who has taken psilocybin or LSD or DMT when they were in their college, university days, does that create someone who is now going to be more interested in these things and then follow it, and they are kind of by default a little bit more out of the box? And when I say out of the box, I do mean some people who are very out of the box. Paul Stamets is a mushroom guy. He's a mycologist, but also his whole world is everything about him is mushrooms. He wears clothes made out of mushroom leather type of deal. And psilocybin is obviously part of the magic mushroom, so he knows a fair bit about that. One of the ladies who was helping out with some of these studies and designing the studies and funding these studies was a girl who had these ideas related to blood flow in the brain and trepanning, which is or trepanning, where you drill a hole in your brain to kind of release. I don't know what that is. Super not scientific, a very more cult, shamanic type deal that's been used in religions and whatnot. And yet she did this, I believe it was in the 70s or maybe the 60s. And did it to herself as well with a drill, electric drill. Yes. Yet you also have more people, I suppose, on the more professional side, if you want to call it that term. So these are people like Roland Griffiths, even Tim Ferriss, if you know him, is very interested in these sort of scientific studies, and there is a growing, I suppose, there's the people who use these substances, take them, and they will attribute more weight to the mysticism portion of it, the kind of religiosity, the very hard to define and measure aspect. And then there's others who are definitely more on the side of, okay, like, let's try and isolate variables. Let's try and study this, make these reproducible, do really good science, because it will have some benefits to humanity and to people if this can be, knowledge is power, I suppose. So there's in any case, a lot of unique individuals come at it. So that's one subjective kind of portion. Something definitely happens. When you take a psychedelic, there is no denying that something is happening. Now, what does it mean? What weight can you put on this? There was a very intriguing aspect here on page 41 that I'd never heard of before, called the noetic quality. So to quote from the book here, here's what I don't get about an experience like Bob Jesse's. Why in the world would you ever credit it at all? I didn't understand why you wouldn't simply file it under interesting dream or drug-induced fantasy. But along with the feeling of ineffability, the conviction that some profound objective truth has been disclosed to you is a hallmark of the mystical experience, regardless of whether it has been occasioned by a drug, meditation, fasting, flagellation, or sensory deprivation. William James gave a name to this conviction, the noetic quality. People feel they have been let in on a deep secret of the universe, and they cannot be shaken from that conviction. As James wrote, dreams cannot stand this test. No doubt this is why some people who have such an experience go on to found religions, changing the course of history, or in a great many more cases, the course of their own lives. No doubt is the key. So something happens, obviously. You see hallucinations, you feel different things, you have a dissolving of the ego. You'll experience some very interesting stuff like synesthesia, where you can see sounds or, senses get mixed up. And it's obviously, obviously something is happening, but why don't people treat it the way they treat dreams, which is, I had a dream where I was an elephant or fighting an elephant, or I made love to an elephant. They don't take that as anything meaningful, and efforts in the past to analyze dreams have always been a little bit kind of sketchy, looking at you, Freud. And yet when people come away from a psychedelic experience, they have this noetic quality. Something has happened, and it means something. It means something deep, and it can change their lives and make them think about this. So my question, I guess, from this is, well, one, that's definitely a subjective thing. And most of them can't explain why as well, is a very common theme of this. So when asked, why didn't you just put this down to a fantasy or a dream or something like that? And they go, I can't explain why, but I know why. I know deep in myself why. The most subjective thing you can get out. So my question is, can this backfire? So when people are kind of using this, or the scientists using this, they're kind of aiming on this to be a beneficial thing in some sort of sense. So the mystical experience adds weight to kind of pre-existing ideas anyway. So if you're feeling depressed, you want to not feel depressed. And so it's kind of adding weight to that not feeling depressed section. And so people have come away from this being, for the first time in my life, I accepted my depression, or I smiled for the first time in many a year. And this has things to do with the default mode network. So this is that over-analyzing ego quality I was talking about before, and deactivating that, which then allows people to kind of get out of their own head, if you want to put it that way. But then also, there's some great stories in here of people who intellectually know that smoking is idiotic, and they can list every single, and so this is the addiction portion. They know it's bad for you. It costs a lot. It's, produces bad teeth and unhealthy hygiene and things like that. They know all of this, and yet they will still smoke. This has kind of allowed them to find getting past the intellectual and hitting the kind of feeling stage where it was, it lost its importance to me, smoking. And it's really funny how this kind of quality of adding weight to something can work this way, this very subjective quality. Yet my question is, can this also increase negative things? So if you come into it with some perhaps faulty ideas related to I don't know, your arrogance or your paranoia or jealousy, and thinking that these are helpful in some sort of way, can this increase these negative, what we would judge from the outside as negative things? So someone comes in who is already paranoid, and then it ramps that up an extra, 20%. Is that something that these drugs can do, or do they have this kind of mystical quality of only working on the good things? I very much doubt that, and this is why the importance of set and setting is so important as well. So a lot of subjective things going on, people, a lot of things like that. I'm going to jump now into my own observations and takeaways, and I do want to just highly stress this is US centric, so the United States. The author is from the United States. Most of the people mentioned are from the United States, and it doesn't contain any history related to Australia or psychedelic use in Scandinavia or in Africa, where there's ones like ibogaine and things like that, and it doesn't even really touch on ayahuasca at all. Really, there's a couple of mentions. So just know that. And then the funny thing with this is it highlighted one thing which America is very good at, and one of their mainstay cultural exports, or I don't even know if I'd call it an export, but the consumerism, American consumerism. And so we see on page 114 where people are starting to learn about the magic mushrooms in particular. And there was a lady called Maria Sabina in Mexico, in Huatla, which is a very a dialect of kind of old Mexico. So they were talking about how they went down there, and basically for Maria Sabina and her village, the attention was ruinous. Wasson would later hold himself responsible for unleashing on lovely Huatla a torrent of commercial exploitation of the vilest kind, as he wrote in a plaintive 1970 New York Times op-ed. Huatla had become first a beatnik, then a hippie mecca, and the sacred mushrooms, once a closely guarded secret, were now being sold openly on the street. Her neighbors blamed her for this, and she, they lost their force. The foreigners spoiled them. From now on, they won't be any good. That's in her own quotes. So you can see how when when people find out about these things, there is a tendency to abuse this somewhat. And then there's another one here where it's going even more mainstream, and actors are getting involved. And so there was the most famous of these patients was Cary Grant, who gave an interview in 1959 to the syndicated gossip columnist Joe Himmons, extolling the benefits of LSD therapy. Grant had more than 60 sessions, and by the end declared himself born again. And then this is in his quotes. All the sadness and vanities were torn away, the 55-year-old actor told Hyams in an interview, all the more surprising in the light of Cary Grant's image as a reserved and proper Englishman. I've had my ego stripped away. A man is a better actor without ego because he has truth in him. Now I cannot behave untruthfully toward anyone, and certainly not to myself. All right, you're starting to see some little bit signs of BS popping in, but continuing on. From the sound of it, LSD had turned Cary Grant into an American. I'm no longer lonely, and I am a happy man, Grant declared. He said the experience had allowed him to overcome his narcissism, greatly improving not only his acting, but his relationships with women. Young women have never been so attracted to me. Not surprisingly, Grant's interview, which received boatloads of national publicity, created a surge in demand for LSD therapy and for just plain LSD. Hyman's received more than 800 letters from readers eager to know how they might obtain it. Psychiatrists called, complaining that their patients were now begging them for LSD. Yes. Just this guy talking about how he's taken LSD and is now super attractive. And I believe he was an older gentleman as well, like in his kind of 50s or 60s. There's something about that American consumerism, which is very ugly, very ugly. I'm not a fan of it. And, maybe I'm picking on America, but it's an American book. And when consumerism shows its head, it's easy to point the blame their way. And in any case, another observation, my final one, is the tone of this book is I think of the correct tone. As if you read it as a whole, it's kind of cautiously optimistic. So the author, Michael Pollan, he talks for long periods about how he had never any interest in these at all. He'd kind of been brainwashed, if you want to put it, by the propaganda of the 60s. And he only started trying some of these when he himself was, I believe, in his late 50s or in his early 60s. So relatively recently, in the last decade or two, was when he was kind of writing this book. Now, this cautious optimism is my general take to drugs as well. I wouldn't dive in willy-nilly to any of these things. Although they can seem to be very fun, although they can seem to have some benefits in terms of treating depression, addiction, or existential angst. Being cautious never has stopped, has never caused problems for me personally, and the diving in willy-nilly and leading and exposing yourself to the possibility of a bad trip as your very first get-go, it seems to be a recipe for disaster and for something that could cause some serious long-term mental issues. And I would highly recommend that if you're interested in any of these things, doing it if you can in a professional type setting. And then if that is not possible, don't dive in all the way. Don't take a heroic dose in the immediate as your first go. I'll leave it at that. So in summary, it's a compelling trip, this book, that walks the fine line between objective, subjective, and the scientific and mystical. So although it may seem daunting from the trip reports that are described within, the downsides seem relatively limited compared to other drugs, in my opinion. Science is catching up to the collective wisdom of the thousands of years of cultural use, of healing, as many of them put it. And it's really exciting to see this. It is exciting to see that there is a new method of understanding the world of natural substances for the most part, and seeing how these can be used for the betterment of humans in a scientific way, without a lot of the woo-woo and bullshit that tends to accompany these things. So the book, How to Change Your Mind, The New Science of Psychedelics by Michael Pollan, I'm giving it a very solid 7 out of 10. I enjoyed it. And that's it for today, my mere mortalites. Thank you for joining me to this part of the video. What are your thoughts on this book? Have you researched much into psychedelics? Have you taken psychedelics yourself? I would love to know all of these things. And leave a comment here. And then also check out the Mere Mortals podcast, because I typically tend to explore the ideas and books like this a bit deeper in conversation with my friend Juan. And it's just a good way to learn more of my ideas about this. You can also learn more in the book recap, which I do at the end of every month, where I thank people who are supporting the show. And so if you're leaving comments and things like that, I will certainly read out any interesting comments if you have any along those lines. So thank you very much once again. I really do hope you're having a fantastic trip wherever you are in the world. Kyron out.